Both Sony and Tamron have come out with new versions of their mid-range zoom lenses. But how do these lenses compare to each other? Let's go over the specs and I'll tell you what I think at the end. Starting out, the most glaring difference between these two lenses is the price. The Tamron is $900 brand new. The Sony costs $2,300 brand new. You can buy 2.5 Tamron lenses for the cost of this Sony lens. The Sony lens is also heavier, coming in at 1.5 pounds or about 700 grams, while the Tamron weighs 1.19 pounds or 540 grams. Both of these lenses are about the same size, coming in at 4.6 inches for the Tamron and 4.7 inches for the Sony. Where things are a little different is the Sony is a 1/2 inch larger in diameter, coming in at 3.5 inches, and the Tamron is 3 inches. This translates into a huge difference in filter size. The huge 82mm front filter size of the Sony 24-70 versus the smaller 67mm on the 28-75 of the Tamron. The 67mm is way more common of a filter size, so if you have filters already, you're more than likely to have a 67mm floating around that you can already use with this Tamron lens. It's much less common that you'll have an 82mm filter thread already. Unless you have the 16-35, it's very unlikely you'll probably have an 82mm filter laying around, so that is one thing to keep in consideration when picking these two lenses as well. The Sony has a zoom ring, focus ring, and aperture ring with an iris lock. There are 2 dedicated customizable buttons, AF/MF switch, and a smooth and tight to adjust the tension throughout the zoom range. The build quality feels much better than the Tamron, but it also weighs more and is 2.5 times the price. The Tamron has 1 customizable button, a focus ring, and a zoom ring. The lack of an AF/MF switch can be frustrating, but you can program these to a toggle. On my A7S III, that is my C2 button right by my record button, but that is one more customizable button that you have to have on your camera. When it comes to autofocus, the 28-75 has very good autofocus in ideal conditions, but in low light situations, it struggles to nail focus quickly without hunting. The Sony 24-70 G Master 2 has great autofocus even in low light situations. In this test, each lens is focusing at its minimum focusing distance to about 8 to 10 feet away. I set the A7 IV's focused shift sensitivity to 5 where I normally keep it, and then I just cranked it to its highest possible setting at 7. The Sony was able to nail focus quickly without hunting at 5 and 7. The way the XD linear motors work on Sony almost always looks like it's quickly racking focus and then slowly easing into nail focus, where the Tamron's VXD linear motors tend to hunt for focus a little bit more and it takes significantly longer in low light situations. These are both played back in real-time speed between 5 and 7 focus sensitivity. This is an extreme test, but it better illustrates the differences between these focusing motors. When it comes to difference in focal length, 4mm might not seem like much of a difference, but once you layer on lens breathing compensation and active stabilization, you have a lot of cropping going in, and having a wide lens to begin with is going to help you out even more here. To be fair, the Tamron doesn't support lens breathing compensation, but after turning off all the features and that crop into the image, the 28 versus the 24 can be difficult to work with in situations where you can't swap lenses and you have to get a wide shot, like in weddings, for example. In my opinion, the extra 5mm on the Tamron at the end of the focal length isn't as important as the extra 4mm at the wider end on the Sony. For general photo and video, it's not a huge difference, but it's something to keep in mind if you need the widest range possible. When it comes to flares between these two lenses, I like the Sony's better. I like the look of the kind of lens leak flare better than the Tamrons, where you can see almost all of the individual pieces of glass reflecting off the light. This can be personal preference, but for me, I like the flares on the 24-70 GM2 better. When it comes to chromatic aberration, both of these lenses have some visible chromatic aberration, but again, it seems like the Sony has less. In high contrast areas, you'll be able to see more color fringing on the Tamron than the Sony. The additional coatings here may be helping, but the Tamron just seems to be struggling a little more with that color fringing. Wide open, you can tell that both lenses have color fringing issues. The Sony is less noticeable, but when you stop it down to f4, it becomes less noticeable on each of these. You can still notice it if you're pixel peeping and zooming in, but for me, the Sony has less, as it should, coming in at 2.5 times the price of the Tamron. For bokeh, both of these lenses have good bokeh, considering they're both zoom lenses. To me, the Tamron looks slightly cleaner, but it's very close. Both lenses have circular bokeh in the center with minimal distortion around the edges. It might just be me, but I think the Tamron has slightly nicer bokeh than the Sony. Tell me if I'm crazy in the comments down below. For sharpness and image quality, the 24-72 has the slight advantage over the Tamron in the center, but it gets more apparent as we move towards the edges at 2.8. Things get less noticeable at f4, where I think these lenses are pretty close throughout the frame. The Sony does look a touch sharper and retains good contrast, but that's 2.5 times the price of the Tamron, so the Tamron's actually holding up very well when we zoom in on the image. Both lenses are very usable, and you may not notice the difference if these lenses were side by side and zoomed in to 200%. The win goes to the Sony, but the Tamron does deserve some recognition for being that close given its price. The Tamron can focus closer than the Sony can at 7.1 inches from the sensor, where the Sony can focus 8.3 inches from the sensor. I find these to be fine for most normal use cases, but the Tamron does win if you want to shoot as close as possible. Both lenses don't have any distracting focus breathing problems. The Sony does have access to that lens breathing compensation to completely eliminate any focus breathing. Unless you're doing a lot of rack focuses though, you may not even notice the difference. On to stabilization for both these lenses, they both lack any optical stabilization. On a gimbal, both these lenses were able to be used on my RS3 Pro. Both lenses were balanced around the middle of the focal range and were able to work well. It is worth noting though that the 70mm, when focused all the way out and the screen was flipped out on my camera, the RS3 Pro had a notification that there was like an out of balance error. I was still able to use it, zoomed in all the way to 70 with my flip screen out. I didn't notice it was a problem until I put my camera down, but that is something to be aware of. The error went away when I flipped my camera screen back in, but that is something to note if you will be using your camera screen out on a newer Sony body with the 24-70 G Master 2. For the Tamron though, I was able to have my screen flipped out throughout the focal range and I didn't get any out of balance notifications on my RS3 Pro. I do have to note that the 24-72 has a switch that I've grown to really enjoy with gimbal work, and that is the zoom tension selector. I'm not sure if that's the technical term for it, but I was using this lens for a wedding on my gimbal and I loved switching between the smooth and tight options. Smooth allowed me to zoom on my gimbal without putting any additional strain on the motors, but I did notice if I left it on tight and I tried to zoom on my gimbal, it would actually really struggle. So if you're going to be zooming this lens on a gimbal, I would keep it on smooth. I do go into more detail in my 24-70 video. I will link that at the end of this video. When choosing between these two lenses, I found myself choosing the Sony more over the Tamron, but this necessarily isn't the best choice for everyone. If you're a beginner and you're just starting out and you don't have a ton of money to throw at a lens, or you mostly use primes and you're looking for a low-cost mid-range zoom, the Tamron 28-75 is an absolute no-brainer. It's the best bang for your buck lens you can get if you understand its limitations. If you're using it on a gimbal, the Tamron is also going to be easier to balance and you can use it for longer periods of time, coming in at a ½ pound lighter. If you're looking for the best autofocus performance, especially in low light, or for client work where having autofocus and nailing it without hunting is necessary, then the 24-70 G Master 2 is the lens for you. It's a slightly wider focal length, so that does come in handy when running and gunning. Do keep in mind that the filter size is much larger on the Sony than the Tamron, so that also adds price to this lens if you don't have filters that you can use with it already. The addition of the aperture ring, zoom tension, AF/MF switch makes it very easy to use on the fly. The 28-75 is a very solid lens that I can confidently recommend to about 90% of the people because it does 90% of what the Sony can do at 2.5 times less than the cost of the Sony. Most people would benefit from buying the Tamron 28-75 and then buying a Sony 35mm 1.8 and a Sony 85mm 1.8 for $2,300 and having 3 great lenses for the cost of one 24-70 GM2. However, if you want the sharpest, best autofocus and flare control of any mid-range zoom, the Sony 24-70 GM2 is the lens for you. Which of these lenses would you choose? Let me know in the comments down below, and check out these videos to learn more about each of these lenses. Thank you guys for sticking around to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.